The rain hit the windshield like static, and for a moment, 13 years collapsed into one breath. My name is Claire. I'm 28 years old, and that night, the night my mother said those words, comes back to me in fragments, the way trauma always does, not as a story, but as a series of sensations. What asphalt? The smell of a stranger's car, pine air freshener, and old coffee. A stranger's hand on my shoulder, steady, when no one else's had been. I was standing backstage at Whitmore University's commencement hall, in a navy blazer I'd chosen specifically because it made me look like exactly what I now was, senior director of the Second Chances Scholarship Program. A woman who built second chances for other people's children because no one had built one for her. Through the gap in the curtain, I could see the front rows filling in. Family rows. I knew, because the event coordinator had shown me the seating chart that morning, that row 12 held 3 people I hadn't spoken to in years. My mother, my father, and Vanessa, 25 now, in her graduation gown, about to receive a degree she'd spend the next hour not knowing was about to become the least memorable part of her day. I hadn't told anyone on the planning committee who I was to her. I hadn't told President Whitfield, who'd invited me to deliver the keynote because of an article about my scholarship work, that one of his graduates shared my blood and my childhood bedroom. I had let that detail stay folded up small inside me, the way I'd learned to fold things a long time ago. 13 years earlier, in a kitchen that smelled like rain coming through an open window, my mother had looked at me, 15 years old, soaked, shaking, holding a duffel bag I'd packed in 4 minutes, and said the sentence that would end one version of my life and, eventually, begin another. You were never really ours. I didn't know yet, backstage, exactly what I was going to do with my 15 minutes at that podium. I only knew that for the first time in 13 years, I was going to be in the same room as my family, and they wouldn't be able to look away. I should explain who I was before that night, because the girl who left in the storm and the woman who built a career out of rescuing strangers' children are not, technically, the same person, even though we share a face. I grew up in a brick colonial in a town outside Hartford, the kind of house with a porch swing that nobody used and a dining room reserved for holidays. My father, Richard, sold commercial insurance and believed deeply in the idea of order, bills paid on time, lawns mowed on Saturdays, conflicts that resolved themselves quietly before dinner. My mother, Diane, ran the house the way some people run companies, efficiently, with clear favorites and clear disappointments, though she would never have used either word. Vanessa was born when I was 3. I don't remember a version of my childhood that didn't include the quiet, persistent sense that she had arrived to correct something about me. She was softer-looking, rounder-cheeked, cried more easily, and was comforted more quickly. I was the practical one, the one who didn't need as much, which in our house was treated less like a compliment and more like a built-in excuse to give me less. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for a child who didn't get enough hugs. I'm telling you because it matters for what happened later, because by the time I was 15, I had already spent over a decade learning a lesson that would nearly cost me everything, that my job in that family was to need nothing, complain about nothing, and absorb whatever was left over after Vanessa had been comforted, complimented, and believed. I didn't see, then, how dangerous that lesson actually was. I thought it made me strong. I thought it made me good. I didn't understand that it had also made me someone who wouldn't fight back, not because I lacked the words, but because some part of me had already decided, long before that night in the kitchen, that I wasn't worth defending. That blind spot didn't disappear when I became an adult. It just got better dressed. The morning of Vanessa's graduation, I drank black coffee in a hotel room 2 miles from the house I grew up in, and I rehearsed my speech in the mirror, the way I always did before a keynote. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me a little. I'd expected them to. Dr. Margaret Hale called while I was doing my makeup. Margaret had been director of pediatric trauma recovery at Hartford General the night a car hit 15-year-old me on Route 9, and 7 years later, she was the closest thing I had to a mother. The kind of relationship built not on blood, but on the much sturdier material of someone simply, consistently showing up. "You don't have to do this," she said. No greeting. That was Margaret. I know. You could give the speech and walk out the side door before the reception. No one has to know you were ever in that house. I know that too. There was a pause on the line, the kind Margaret used when she wanted you to hear your own silence. Claire, what do you actually want from today? I looked at myself in the mirror, composed, professional, a woman who'd spent 13 years building a life entirely without the people sitting in row 12, and I said the truest thing I'd said out loud in a long time. I want them to finally see me. Just once. Without flinching away from it. Margaret didn't try to talk me out of wanting that. She just said, then go be seen, and hung up, which was about as close to a blessing as she ever gave. I finished my makeup. I put on the blazer. And I drove to Whitmore University not knowing yet how the day would end, only that I was finally, after 13 years, walking toward the room instead of away from it. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would speak. It was whether, once I did, I would be able to stop. To understand the storm, you have to understand the 10 years that led up to it, because nothing about that night was sudden. It only looked sudden from the outside. I was a good student, not flashy, but steady, the kind of kid teachers describe as a pleasure to have in class, because I never demanded anything from them. Vanessa was a different kind of good student, brilliant in bursts, chaotic in between, the type who forgot homework but charmed her way out of consequences with a wobbling lip and a perfectly timed tear. I used to watch her do it, turn a missed assignment into a moment where the teacher comforted her, and feel something I couldn't name yet. Not quite jealousy. More like a low, persistent hum of unfairness that I'd learned not to mention, because mentioning it always somehow became about my attitude rather than her behavior. By the time we were in high school, the pattern had a rhythm to it. Vanessa would do something, borrow, break, lose, blame, and within an hour, the household weather would shift entirely around managing her feelings about it. My job, unstated but absolutely clear, was to not add to the weather. To be the calm one. The reasonable one. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know why it always worked that way, but because some younger part of me had already decided the answer would hurt more than the not knowing. There was a boy that year, Ethan Reyes, a junior with an easy laugh and an unfair amount of charm, who sat 2 seats behind me in AP History and who Vanessa had decided, with the absolute certainty of a 14-year-old, belonged to her. I didn't think about Ethan the way she thought I did. We talked about homework. Once, we talked about a documentary on the Cold War for 20 minutes after the bell rang, and I remember walking home that day feeling lighter than I had in months, not because of him, but because for 20 minutes, nobody needed anything from me. I didn't know, walking home that afternoon, that those 20 minutes were about to become the hinge that the rest of my adolescence swung on. The first sign came 3 days later. Vanessa stopped talking to me, not dramatically, not with a slammed door, but with a kind of cold, careful silence that I now recognize as the sound of someone building a case. She watched me with an expression I couldn't place. At dinner, she answered our parents in short sentences and looked at her plate. I asked her once if everything was okay. "Fine," she said, in the tone that means the opposite. I let it go. That was, I think now, the first quiet mistake, not a catastrophic one, but a habit of letting things go that would later cost me more than I understood. I told myself I was being respectful of her space. Looking back, I was avoiding a conversation I was afraid would turn into something about me being wrong, the way conversations in our house so often did. I remember the smell of dinner that night, my mother's chicken and rice, the particular sourness of the kitchen when the window was cracked for the steam, and I remember thinking, something's coming. I didn't act on the thought. I just carried it with me, the way you carry a stone in your shoe, irritating, but apparently not worth stopping to remove. A week later, Vanessa told a cluster of girls at her lunch table that I'd been spreading a rumor about one of them, something cruel and specific, something I'd never said, would never have thought to say. I didn't find out until the rumor had already made its second loop through the school and come back to me, warped, as something I'd supposedly said about Vanessa herself. I confronted her about it in the hallway between classes, the only time I ever raised my voice with her before everything fell apart. "I never said that, Vanessa. Why would you tell people I did?" She looked at me with wide, wet eyes, the exact expression that had gotten her out of 100 household consequences. "I didn't say it was you," she said. "Everyone just assumed." It wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true even then. But I also knew, with the flat certainty of someone who'd lived in that house her whole life, that if I pushed the issue at home, I would somehow end up apologizing to her by the end of the night. So I didn't push it. I went quiet instead, which had always been my version of armor. I didn't know yet that quiet wasn't going to be enough this time. Vanessa wasn't just spreading a rumor for fun. She was laying groundwork for what I couldn't have guessed, not in 100 years, because the version of cruelty she was capable of hadn't shown itself to me yet. I still believed, in the deepest, most unexamined part of myself, that whatever was happening between us was a sibling thing. A phase. Something that would resolve the way most adolescent friction resolves slowly, without anyone needing to name it. That belief was the first red flag I would later understand I'd badly misread. I thought I was being patient. I was actually being unprepared. By the time the leaves started turning that October, the house had a different temperature to it, something tense under the surface, something I felt in my shoulders before I could have articulated it in words. I started spending more time in my room. I started, without really deciding to, rehearsing conversations with my parents that I never had the nerve to start. I didn't know it then, but I was already living in the last weeks of the only family I'd ever known. The contradictions started small enough that I told myself I was imagining them. Vanessa began telling our parents things that weren't quite lies, but weren't quite true either. Small distortions, the kind that build a foundation before anyone notices it's being poured. She told my mother I'd been weird about Ethan. She told my father I'd been short with her, dismissive, that I rolled my eyes when she talked. None of it was dramatic enough to provoke a direct confrontation. All of it was dramatic enough to slowly recalibrate the way my parents looked at me. I noticed it first in small adjustments, the way my mother's questions to me got shorter, more clipped, while her questions to Vanessa stretched longer, softer, full of the kind of gentle follow-up that signals real attention. I noticed it in the way my father started knocking before entering my room, a courtesy he'd never extended before, and I told myself it was nothing, a phase of normal teenage privacy. Something tightened in my chest every time I walked into the kitchen and found my mother and Vanessa already mid-conversation, voices dropping slightly when I appeared. I didn't ask what they'd been talking about. I told myself it wasn't my business. I think now that I already knew, on some unconscious level, that asking would force me to confront something I wasn't ready to face, that I had already, quietly, become the subject rather than a participant in my own family's conversations. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from sensing a shift in the emotional weather of your own house without being able to name its source. I felt it in my stomach before I felt it anywhere else, a low, persistent unease that I mistook, for weeks, for ordinary teenage anxiety. I was sleeping less. I'd started chewing the inside of my cheek, a habit I hadn't had before that year and would carry, in milder forms, well into adulthood. I confided in exactly one person, a friend named Priya, who lived 2 streets over and had known both Vanessa and me since elementary school. She's been telling people things, I told Priya, sitting on her bedroom floor on a Friday afternoon, the carpet smelling faintly of her family's incense. Not huge lies. Just Ben's. Little ones. About what? I don't know exactly. About me. The way I act. Things I supposedly said. Priya frowned. Has she said anything about Ethan? I shook my head, though something in my stomach dropped at the question, a small lurch I didn't examine closely enough at the time. Why would she? No reason, Priya said, too quickly, and I let that go too, another small mistake in a pattern I was building without realizing it, a pattern of declining to chase down threads that frightened me, even when some animal part of me already sensed they led somewhere important. That detail seemed insignificant in the moment. It wasn't. Priya knew something or suspected something that I wasn't yet willing to look at directly. The first real crack came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the storm. I came home from school to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table with an expression I'd never seen aimed at me before, not anger exactly, but a kind of wary, evaluating coldness, the look you give someone you're not sure you trust anymore. Sit down, she said. I sat. Vanessa told me something, my mother said, and I want to hear your side before I decide what to think. My stomach turned to ice. Hear what side of what? She says you've been talking about her behind her back. To people at school. Saying things. My mother's hands were folded on the table, very still, the way they got when she was holding something in carefully. She says you've been jealous of her. That you don't think she deserves the things she has. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, not literally, but in that specific way fear distorts a room. Mom, I haven't said anything like that. I don't even know what she's talking about. She seemed very upset, Claire. She's lying. The word landed in the kitchen like something breaking. My mother's face didn't change much, but something behind her eyes closed, a door shutting that I would spend years afterward trying and failing to find the handle to again. That's a serious thing to say about your sister. It's a serious thing for her to say about me, I said, my voice shaking now, when it isn't true. My mother didn't answer that directly. She just said, I'll talk to her, in a tone that made clear the conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over and that whatever conclusion she'd already reached before I sat down hadn't moved an inch. I went up to my room that night and lay on my bed in the dark, listening to the particular silence of a house where something has shifted and no one will say what. I didn't cry. I remember being almost proud of that, in the strange, misplaced way teenagers take pride in suppressing exactly the feelings that most need attention. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding, not what is Vanessa saying about me, but why does my mother believe her so easily, and why does she not extend me the same easy belief in return? I didn't ask it. I was 15, and some questions are too large and too frightening to ask out loud, especially when you suspect, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that you already know the answer and that the answer will hurt more than the silence does. I told myself things would calm down. I told myself it was a misunderstanding that would dissolve with time, the way most family friction eventually does. I did not yet understand that Vanessa wasn't building a misunderstanding. She was building a case. The night everything collapsed started, as these things often do, with something almost absurdly small. It was a Thursday in late October, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves, rain already threatening in a sky the color of a bruise. I'd stayed late at school for a study group, 4 of us working through a calculus problem set in the library, Ethan among them, nothing more significant than 4 kids hunched over graphing calculators under fluorescent light. I got a ride home from Priya's older brother and walked in the door a little after 7, soaked from the short dash between his car and our porch, to find the house unnaturally quiet. My father's car was in the driveway. The living room light was on. But no one called out my name the way they usually did, and that absence of sound told me something before any words did. I found them in the kitchen, my mother, my father, and Vanessa, who was sitting at the table with her arms wrapped around herself, crying in the particular performative way I'd watched her cry 100 times before. Except this time something about it had an edge I hadn't seen. "Sit down, Claire," my father said. His voice was heavier than I'd ever heard it. I sat. My duffel bag, the one I'd later pack in 4 desperate minutes, was nowhere near my mind yet. I still believed, even walking into that kitchen, that whatever this was, it could be explained. Vanessa has shown us some things, my mother said, that we need to talk about. Vanessa, without lifting her head fully, slid her phone across the table toward our parents. I caught a glimpse of a screen, text messages, screenshots, something laid out with a kind of careful presentation that should have struck me immediately as strange, though in the moment all I felt was confusion, then dread. "She says you've been telling people at school that she's a liar," my father said. "That you've been spreading rumors about her relationship with Marcus." I didn't know who Marcus was. I'd never heard the name before that night, and the gap between my confusion and their certainty was the first true vertigo of the evening. "And she says," my father continued, his voice dropping, "that you grabbed her. Hard. 2 days ago. She has a bruise." Vanessa pulled up her sleeve. There was a bruise on her upper arm, yellow-green at the edges, clearly days old already, clearly not something that had happened 2 days before. I stared at it, and something in me went very still and very cold. "I never touched her," I said. "I haven't touched her arm in months. I don't even know what that bruise is from." "Why would she lie about something like this?" my mother asked, and the question wasn't curious. It was already an accusation dressed as a question. I don't know, I said, and my voice cracked on the second word. Mom, I don't know why she's lying, but she is. Ask her where that bruise actually came from. Ask her who Marcus even is. Vanessa, through her tears, said, I don't want to make this worse, in the soft, wounded voice that had ended every argument she'd ever lost in our house before it could properly begin. And I watched my parents' faces soften toward her and harden toward me in the same breath, a single fluid motion I'd witnessed 1,000 times in smaller forms and never once at this scale. I didn't yet understand the full architecture of what she'd built, the screenshots doctored or taken out of context, the bruise from some other source entirely, the elaborate emotional staging, but I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that I was not going to win this conversation with the truth. The truth wasn't actually what was being weighed here. What was being weighed was 13 years of practiced belief in her and practiced out in me, and no fact I produced in that kitchen was going to outweigh that history in one evening. I made a choice then that I would spend years second-guessing. I stopped defending myself. Not because I'd run out of things to say, but because some old, exhausted part of me had already concluded that defending myself had never worked before and wasn't about to start working now. I went quiet, the way I always went quiet, and in the silence, my parents read confirmation instead of defeat. I think, my mother said slowly, that you need to take some responsibility here, Claire. For what? For something I didn't do. For the way you've been treating your sister. My mother's voice had a finality to it now, the sound of a decision being made rather than discussed. We've watched this for months. The coldness. The comments. And now this. She gestured at the phone, at the bruise, at the whole staged tableau of evidence. Something has to change. The rain had started outside, hard against the kitchen window, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it sounded like applause. What do you want me to do? I asked, and I genuinely didn't know what answer I was bracing for. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the table. And then my mother said the sentence that would end the only childhood I'd ever known. I think you need to go stay somewhere else for a while. Until we figure this out. Go where? It's pouring outside. It's almost 8 at night. That's not really my problem to solve right now, Claire. I looked at Vanessa. For 1/2 second, so brief I would spend years wondering if I'd imagined it, something flickered across her face that wasn't grief at all. It looked, if anything, like relief or even the faintest, most carefully buried satisfaction. I didn't have language for it then. I would later understand it as the look of someone watching a plan succeed. I went upstairs. I packed a duffel bag with whatever fit in 4 shaking minutes, a sweatshirt, my retainer case, a photo of Priya and me from 6th grade, my school laptop. I came back downstairs already crying, though I tried to hide it, and stood in the front hallway while my mother stood by the door, arms crossed, her face unreadable in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. Mom, please. It's raining. Where am I supposed to go? And that's when she said it, not shouted, not cruel in tone, almost matter of fact, which somehow made it worse. You were never really ours, Claire. Not the way Vanessa is. Maybe it's time you figured that out for yourself. I don't know exactly what she meant by it, whether it was about adoption rumors I'd have heard as a child and never had confirmed, about some old grievance between her and my father's side of the family, or simply the truest version of 13 years of unequal love finally spoken aloud. I never got the chance to ask her to clarify, because by the time I might have asked, I was already outside, in the storm, walking with no destination, the duffel bag growing heavier with rain. I want to tell you I understood, in that moment, the full shape of what Vanessa had done, the lie about the rumor, the fabricated relationship with a boy named Marcus I'd never met, the bruise from some unrelated source repurposed as evidence against me. I didn't. All I understood, walking blind through the rain on Route 9, was that the people who were supposed to choose me had chosen someone else, decisively, and that I had nowhere to go and no one, in that moment, who would come looking. I didn't see the car until its headlights swept the wet road in front of me, far too close, far too fast for me to do anything but freeze. The applause inside Whitmore University's commencement hall faded as President Whitfield gestured toward the podium, and for a strange, suspended second, I felt 13 years of distance compress into the width of a single breath. "Please welcome our keynote speaker," he said, Claire, founder and senior director of the Second Chances Scholarship Program, and one of the most compelling voices in education policy working today. I walked to the podium in low heels that clicked against polished floor, and I found row 12 almost immediately, the way you find a familiar face in any crowd, without trying. My father sat with his hands folded the way he always had, a posture I recognized in my bones. My mother sat upright, composed, the picture of a proud parent at her daughter's graduation. And Vanessa, in her black gown, hadn't yet registered who was about to speak. Why would she? 13 years had changed my face, my name's context, the entire shape of my public life. I began the way I'd planned, with the bones of the story, no names yet, the way I always open this particular talk. When I was 15 years old, I said, I was thrown out of my home, in the middle of a storm, because someone I trusted told a lie that was easier for the people around her to believe than the truth I was telling. I watched, almost clinically, as something in my mother's posture changed, a small, almost imperceptible stiffening, the kind of recognition that hasn't yet become alarm. I was hit by a car 40 minutes later, walking alone on a road I had no business walking on at night, in weather no one should be out in. A doctor named Margaret Hale happened to be driving home from a late shift. She stopped. She didn't have to. Most people wouldn't have. She became, over the following years, the only consistent adult presence in my life, not because we were related, but because she chose, again and again, to show up. I felt my own voice steady itself on the next sentence, the way it always did once I'd crossed the hardest part. I tell you this story today not because I want your pity, but because I want you to understand something about the program I represent. Second Chances exists because I know, intimately, what it costs a person to be disbelieved by the people who were supposed to protect them. And I know what it can look like when one person, just one, decides to believe you instead. By now, I could see Vanessa in row 12. I watched the exact moment recognition crossed her face, not slow, the way you might imagine, but sudden, like a held breath finally breaking. Her hand went to her mouth. My mother turned to look at her and then, following the direction of Vanessa's frozen stare, turned to look back at me at the podium with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, the particular, dawning horror of someone realizing, in real time, that the past has just walked onto a stage they cannot leave. I did not say their names. I had decided that morning, in the hotel mirror, that I wouldn't, that naming them would make this about revenge, and revenge had never actually been what I wanted. What I wanted, the thing I'd told Margaret on the phone, was to be seen without anyone being able to look away. I had that now, completely, whether I named them or not. I spent years, I continued, my voice even, believing that I deserved less than the people around me, less attention, less defense, less benefit of the doubt, because that's what I'd been taught, implicitly, over and over, before I even had the words to recognize it as teaching. It took me a long time to understand that the way a family treats its least offended member often reveals more about that family than anything they'd ever say about themselves out loud. My father's hands, I noticed, had stopped being folded. They gripped the edge of his knees now, white-knuckled. I'm not here to tell you that every family is broken, or that every conflict ends the way mine did, I said. I'm here to tell you what I built instead, because that's the part of the story I actually want you to remember. Second Chances exists to fund the educations of students who were failed by systems, by circumstances, by people who should have protected them and didn't. We've funded 143 students since the program began. Not one of them needed to be perfect to deserve support. They just needed someone to finally believe them. I finished the speech the way I'd written it weeks earlier, with statistics about outcomes and gratitude toward the university for the invitation, applause rising warm and unaware around 3 frozen people in row 12. I stepped down from the podium with my pulse steady, my hands dry, 13 years of carefully built composure holding exactly as I'd trained it to. The reception happened in a tented courtyard behind the main hall, string lights strung between poles, the smell of catered hors d'oeuvres and cut grass. I was talking to President Whitfield about a potential partnership grant when I felt someone behind me, and turned to find my father standing there, his graduation day blazer slightly too tight across the shoulders, his face pale in a way I'd never seen on him. "Claire," he said. "Just my name. Nothing else," for a long moment. "Hello, Richard," I said, and watched something in him flinch at the use of his first name, at the absence of Dad. "That story," he started and then stopped, his jaw working. "Was that?" "It was real," I said. "Every word. Margaret had taught me, years before, that you don't owe anyone a performance of your own pain just because they're finally ready to witness it." I kept my voice level, polite, the voice I used with strangers at professional events, which is exactly what he was to me now. My mother appeared a moment later, Vanessa trailing slightly behind her, mascara streaked despite obvious attempts to fix it. My mother's face had none of my father's confusion in it. Hers had something closer to fear. "Claire," she said, "can we talk somewhere private?" "We're talking right here," I said. "This is as private as I'm willing to make it." "That story you told," my mother said, lowering her voice, glancing around at the crowd of graduates and families nearby, "you didn't say our names." "Thank you for that, at least." "I didn't say your names because this isn't about punishing you in front of strangers," I said. "It's never been about that." Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice thin. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I was a kid. I didn't know it would." "You knew exactly what it would do," I said, and for the first time that day, something sharp slipped into my voice, 13 years of restraint finally cracking at the edges. "You made up a relationship with a boy I'd never met. You used a bruise from somewhere else and pretended I gave it to you. You built an entire case against a 15-year-old because she talked to a boy for 20 minutes in a hallway. You knew exactly what you were doing, Vanessa. You were 17, not 5. I didn't think they'd actually throw you out," Vanessa said, crying harder now. "I thought they'd just be mad at you for a few days. I didn't think." "You didn't think about me at all," I said. "That's the part you're still not saying. You didn't think about what would happen to me. You thought about what you wanted, which was Ethan's attention and Mom and Dad's sympathy, and you got both, and you let me disappear to get them." My mother's composure finally broke, just slightly, around the eyes. "We didn't know about the car. We didn't know you'd been hurt until Dr. Hale called us, weeks later, and by then I'd already decided I didn't want to come back," I said. "Yes, that's correct. We've thought about that night every day for 13 years, my father said, his voice rough. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, in the strange, complicated way you can mean something and still feel almost nothing change inside you because of it. "I believe you've suffered over it. I believe you've replayed it. But I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now. Thinking about it isn't the same as having done anything differently when it actually mattered. You had 13 years to call. You had 13 years to ask Vanessa, directly, what really happened that night. You chose not to, because the version where you were right was easier to live inside than the version where you'd failed me." The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and complete, the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a small circle understands that something true and unkind has just been spoken, and no one has the right to argue with it. "What do you want from us?" my mother finally asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question, a woman who had run out of scripts. "Nothing," I said. "That's the part one don't think you're going to like hearing. I don't want an apology tour. I don't want family dinners. I built an entire life, a good one, without any of you in it, and I'm not interested in making room for guilt I didn't ask you to carry." I looked at Vanessa, who had gone very still, mascara drying in uneven tracks down her face. "I hope you figure out, eventually, what it actually cost you to win that night. Because you did win it. You got to stay. You got the comfort, the belief, the bedroom, the photos on the wall. I just don't think you've ever had to look directly at what that win was actually made of." I excused myself to rejoin Whitfield's circle of donors, my pulse, even then, remarkably even, and left the three of them standing under the string lights in the kind of silence that doesn't resolve in a single evening, that simply sits, heavy, in the space where a family used to be. The voicemails started 2 days later. My mother's first message was 11 minutes long, recorded in a voice I almost didn't recognize, not the composed, evaluating voice from my childhood, but something rawer, full of long pauses, as if she were discovering the words as she said them. My father sent an email, formal in structure, almost like a business letter, apologizing for the events of that evening in language so careful it told me more about his fear of saying the wrong thing than about any actual reckoning underneath it. Vanessa sent 3 emails over the course of a month. The first was defensive, full of context I hadn't asked for. The second was angrier than the first, accusing me of humiliating her on her own graduation day, a complaint that, even now, makes something in my chest go tight with disbelief at the audacity required to write it. The third, the one that finally felt different, arrived on a Tuesday in November, 3 lines long. I know I can't undo it. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I know what I did, finally, without making excuses for it. I'm sorry, Claire. I really am. I read that one twice. I didn't respond to any of them. My father drove out to see me in early December, 3 hours, unannounced, standing on the porch of the apartment I shared with no one, looking older than I remembered him being, though it had only been 13 years and he was, by any measure, not yet old at all. I'm not asking to come in, he said, standing in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets. I just wanted to say it to your face. I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions that night. I should have asked more questions for 13 years afterward. I was a coward, and I let your mother carry decisions I should have fought her on, and I think some part of me knew that, even at the time, and I let it happen anyway because it was easier. I stood in my doorway, the December cold cutting through my sweater, and felt something complicated move through me, not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it, a recognition of honesty that I hadn't expected from him. Thank you for saying that, I said. I mean that. But I'm not going to invite you in, and I'm not going to start calling you on Sundays. I built a life that doesn't have a hole in it shaped like this family anymore. I'm not interested in reopening that shape just because you're finally ready to apologize. He nodded, slowly, like a man absorbing a verdict he'd expected. Can I ask you one thing? You can ask. Are you happy? Genuinely. I thought about Margaret, about the kids in my scholarship program whose faces I knew by name, about the apartment behind me with its overgrown balcony plants and its complete absence of anyone who needed me to be smaller than I was. Yes, I said. I really am. He nodded again, something in his face settling into a kind of grief that wasn't about losing me that day. It was about a loss that had already happened, years earlier, that he was only now allowing himself to fully feel. That's good, he said. That's more than I think we deserve to hear, honestly. But I'm glad. He left without trying to extend the conversation further, and I watched his car pull away from the curb, and I did not cry, and I noticed myself noticing that, the way you notice the absence of pain in a tooth that used to ache. I called Margaret that night. He came by, I told her. My father. How was it? Honest, actually. More honest than I expected. I sat on my balcony despite the cold, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the lit windows of the building across the street. I think I expected to feel triumphant. After the speech, after the reception. I thought finally being seen would feel like winning something. And it doesn't? It feels quieter than that, I said. Like something just finished. Not won. Finished. Margaret was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she used when she wanted me to keep talking rather than fill the space herself. I spent so many years, I continued, believing that if I could just make them see what they'd done, it would undo something in me. Fix some old, broken part. And it didn't. The speech didn't fix anything. My father's apology didn't fix anything. I think I'm only now understanding that there was never going to be a moment of being seen that fixed it, because the thing that actually needed fixing wasn't their understanding. It was mine. What do you mean? I think I spent 13 years building a life that would force them to finally believe I was worth something, I said slowly, the realization arriving as I spoke it, the way the truest ones always seem to. But the program, the career, the whole life, none of that was ever really for them. I just told myself it was, because it was easier to aim all that effort at an audience than to admit I was actually doing it for myself, that I'd already decided I was worth something long before they showed up in row 12 to witness it. That sounds like it took you a long time to say out loud. 13 years, I said, and almost laughed, the sound surprising me in the cold air. Give or take. 6 months later, I haven't spoken to my mother. I exchange occasional, brief texts with my father, nothing deep, mostly logistics, the kind of contact you might have with a distant cousin rather than a parent, which feels, strangely, like exactly the right amount. Vanessa sent one more email in the spring, shorter than the others, simply asking if I'd ever consider meeting for coffee, no pressure, no expectations. I haven't answered it yet. I might, eventually. I might not. I've stopped feeling like I owe anyone, including myself, a timeline for that decision. The scholarship program funded its 150th student last month, a 16-year-old named Sophia who reminded me, in small, unbearable ways, of myself at that age, careful, watchful, used to needing less than she actually needed. I sat across from her at the orientation lunch and watched her flinch slightly when I asked what she wanted, as if the question itself were a kind of trap. You can answer honestly, I told her. Nobody's going to take it back from you for wanting something. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to believe it, and then, quietly, she told me. I wrote it down. I made sure it happened. That, I've come to understand, is the actual shape of the life I built, not a life designed to make my family finally see me, but a life designed to make sure other people's invisible children get seen faster than I did, with less wreckage along the way. I think about the storm sometimes, the actual rain on Route 9, the headlights sweeping too close, too fast. I think about Margaret's hands steady on the steering wheel of the car that pulled over when no one had to. I think about my mother's voice in that kitchen, flat and final. You were never really ours. She was wrong about the sentence, though maybe not in the way she meant it. I was never really theirs, not in the sense of belonging to people who would choose me without conditions. But I was always completely my own. It just took losing everything in a storm to finally understand that the difference between those two things was the only inheritance that ever actually mattered. I still don't know if I'll ever meet Vanessa for that coffee. Some nights I think I will, eventually, on my own terms, in my own time. Other nights I think the most honest gift I can give either of us is simply letting that chapter stay closed. Either way, I know this now, with a certainty 13 years in the making. Whatever I decide, it will be because I chose it, not because anyone, ever again, gets to tell me what I am. The most painful detail in this story isn't the storm, or the car, or even the sentence in the kitchen. It's the 20 minutes in a hallway over a documentary about the Cold War, the smallest, most innocent moment imaginable, the kind of moment that happens between teenagers 1,000 times a day without consequence, and how completely disproportionate the punishment for it turned out to be. That disproportion is really what this story is about. Not betrayal in the abstract, but the specific mechanism by which small, ordinary moments get weaponized inside families that already have an imbalance of belief running underneath them. Vanessa's lie didn't work because it was clever. It worked because it was deposited into an account that had already been accumulating credit for years. Every small comfort extended to her over Claire, every small doubt extended toward Claire over her, compounding quietly until one dramatic night cashed out the entire balance at once. What's worth sitting with is how unremarkable the early warning signs were. A teenager going quiet. A parent asking shorter questions of one child and longer ones of another. None of it, on its own, would register as dangerous. That's precisely what makes generational favoritism so corrosive. It rarely announces itself as cruelty. It accumulates as 1,000 small inattentions, each one too minor to justify a confrontation, until the day arrives when the accumulated weight gets used against the very child who absorbed it quietly for years. There's also something important in what Claire's parents did and didn't do in the aftermath. They didn't investigate. They didn't ask Vanessa a single hard follow-up question, where the bruise actually came from, who Marcus actually was. Because asking would have required confronting the possibility that the daughter they found easier to love was also capable of architecting a lie sophisticated enough to end her sister's place in the household. It was easier to believe the simple, comfortable story than the complicated, damning one. That's not unique to this family. It's a pattern visible in almost every situation where favored children are protected from scrutiny at the direct expense of the less favored sibling. The protection isn't really about the favored child's innocence. It's about the parent's unwillingness to revisit a story they've already decided to believe. Claire's own blind spot deserves equal attention, not as a way of distributing blame evenly, but because it's instructive in its own right. Her instinct to go quiet rather than fight wasn't cowardice, it was a learned, rational response to a household where defending herself had never once changed an outcome in her favor. But that same instinct, on the night of the storm, became the very thing that allowed the false narrative to stand unchallenged in the room. There's a hard truth buried in that. Sometimes the coping mechanisms that protect us in chronic situations become exactly the wrong tool in the acute moment that finally demands a different response. Claire didn't lose that night because she was weak. She lost it because the skill she'd spent a decade perfecting, strategic silence, was no match for a sister who had spent the same decade perfecting strategic performance. The keynote speech, 13 years later, isn't really revenge, despite how satisfying it might feel to frame it that way. It's closer to an audit. Claire doesn't lie, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't even name names. She simply states what happened, in front of the people who built their piece on the assumption that no one would ever say it out loud in a room they couldn't leave. The discomfort that follows isn't punishment she inflicted. It's a debt that had been accruing interest, unpaid, for 13 years, finally coming due in public. What ultimately makes this story land isn't the exposure itself, it's what Claire does afterward, when she's offered exactly the apologies she once might have begged for, and discovers they don't repair what she expected them to repair. The lesson buried there is uncomfortable but true. The people who hurt us rarely get to be the ones who heal us, even when they're finally willing to try. Healing, when it comes, tends to arrive on a completely different schedule, built by completely different hands, in Claire's case, by a stranger who stopped her car on a dark road and never stopped showing up afterward. What stays with me about this story is how ordinary the original sin actually was: a teenage crush, a misread conversation, a 15-year-old who didn't even realize she'd done anything worth lying about. Most family ruptures start exactly like that, small, survivable, almost embarrassingly minor, until someone decides the lie is more comfortable than the truth, and a household built on quiet imbalance finally tips all the way over. I think about how long Claire carried the instinct to stay quiet, and how that instinct, which once felt like her flaw, eventually became unrecognizable as the same trait that let her build an entire career out of believing the unbelieved. Maybe that's the real shape of healing, not erasing the parts of ourselves that got hurt, but finding new, better places to put them. If anything in this story should follow you afterward, let it be this. The people who needed to fight for you back then might never fully understand what it cost you that they didn't. And you get to decide, on your own schedule, whether that's a debt worth waiting for them to pay.